Welcome everyone. Episode 4. Why can't I do math this season? Is it 4? Is it 4?
Yes, it is.
Welcome everyone. I am happy. Random guest again. Okay, Eric, I will not call you random. Eric Villaverde, please introduce yourself.
My name is Eric Villaverde. I'm a biological science major in Florida International University.
I asked Eric, so Eric is going to join my program, and Eric just came by the city lab, physically city lab, and I said, hey, since you're here, why don't you help me introduce our podcast? So today's episode, which you don't even know yet, but I'll tell you. Segev's been saying all season, yeah, we're going global. And it sounds great when he says it, but honestly, it's only really as we got into the episodes, I'm like, yeah, in truth and fact, every episode has been someone from a different country. So this week, Dr. Jessica Riddell, Bishop's University in Canada, and she's going to talk about a book she wrote called Hope Circuits, and it's this whole notion of transformational change at the whole institution level. Okay. What I loved about her is that she's a Shakespearean scholar, and so she brings all of this kind of ways of being in the world, of course, told through his eyes, but how that then informs her thinking on university change. As a student, Eric, real quick, if you had to, you were sitting in front of a president or provost right now and said, these are ways in which I think you can better support your students, what would you tell them?
I think a lot of the issue stems when you're going into a class and you're bombarded with a lot of, I wouldn't necessarily call it jargon, but there's this word in where it's like active recall and like active learning and stuff like that. And it's a very large concept in order for you to process the information, for you to study and then learn and then also practice for the test, because you're worried about your grade, you're worried about a lot of different things, so you mainly focus on getting that A instead of actually learning. And one of the classes that doesn't do
which
this,
is two different things,
right? Two different things, because it's like if you're getting the grade, then you have to worry about always getting the 100 or getting the I guess B or C, whatever suits you.
You know what the active recall, active learning thing just reminded me of?
What?
My time in chemistry 1 for 2021.
Definitely.
I remember I had a lot to remember in Chem 1, and I'm not even a bio major, anything close to that.
Right.
I enjoyed the class, but it was a lot to remember, so that took me back.
No, it's definitely a lot, particularly because like they focus too much on you have to learn actively. Like they don't really explain what that means.
Interesting.
So if I felt like if there was maybe a course before the study of like the knowledge itself or knowing what active learning is, it'd be better.
That's good feedback, because that speaks to training that the professors themselves need to have on how to communicate things we know to be true, that are evidence-based, but sometimes we go into classrooms and assume students know what we mean when we say certain things. I really hope you enjoyed today's episode, because Dr. Riddell gets into a little bit of what you're saying, Eric, but perhaps at a high level, in the sense that what are the kinds of policies and support that professors need? What kind of environment do they need to work in order to be better prepared to serve students like yourself? I hope you enjoy it. See you at the end. Welcome to Knowledge Unbound, everybody. I have with me a good friend, a thought partner. It's hard to describe, put Jessica in a box, but maybe that's the thing I shouldn't do, which is try to put Jessica in a box. And as we always do, is I always want my guests to tell their own story. So, Dr. Jessica Riddell, that's as much as I'll say about you. Why don't you tell our listeners who you are? And here's the rub, right? You're going to tell us a little bit about your journey. You don't necessarily have to start from when you were 2 years old, but tell us about a little bit of your journey as an academic that has led to the kind of things you're involved in now.
Well, and you just used the word that's the rub, which is from Shakespeare. And I am a Shakespearean scholar.
I did not know that was from Shakespeare. Okay.
It is. And there's so much Shakespeare that animates our cultural imaginary. And I make a joke when I introduce myself, because I sit in a bunch of different places and spaces, and I work on systems change and rewiring organizations. But my origin story is as a Shakespearean, as somebody who sees the world in 3 dimensions. And so what I mean by that is that in a Shakespeare play, you show up and a world that is separate from ours emerges in conversation, in bodies, in 3 dimension over about 3 hours.
So you show up as a reader, as an audience member,
as a spectator,
okay.
And you watch this world unfold in real time, and there is no omniscient narrator. So there's nobody saying, Brian, I need you to pay attention to this because this is the bad guy and this is the good guy. There's nobody who gives you that guidance. You have to figure it out yourselves. And what is happening is each character in a Shakespeare play is imperfect and messy and working through the world, encountering radical change and hoping for a happy ending.
Is that how you would describe all Shakespearean plays, or is that sort of a through line through how those plays are constructed? Do you see what I'm saying? Because, and here's why I ask. Did a little bit of Shakespeare when I was 13, right?
Yeah, you did.
Back in Trinidad. And I remember my teacher had really focused in on Julius Caesar. And I remember this one line. I mean, this is maybe credit to Rafiq Mohammed, Form 3, Hillview College, focusing on when Julius Caesar's brother Brutus murdered him, and there was a line that said, "Et tu, Brute, then fall Caesar." All right, and he was saying, well, if you betray me too, then there's no point staying alive, right? And of course, then it goes into the old Mark Antony, if I'm correct, came after that, right? So one of the things we were doing, I think he was trying to do in analyzing that text, is showing the imperfection of each character, right? Everybody had both good and bad. I don't know if he quite said it that way, but hearing you say this maybe made me reflect on that experience.
Yes.
Am I in the ballpark?
You are absolutely in the ballpark. So Brutus believes that he is doing the best thing for the Republic, that he is doing something that is justified, that is justice, that is for the collective good when he murders Julius Caesar. And Mark Antony steps up and says, Brutus, I know that you had very good will, but here's the impact. And Mark Antony gives a very different perspective. And for me, that is such a microcosm in Shakespeare's plays for the ways in which we understand a civic democracy, where we are all, I fundamentally believe, have goodwill and good intention.
Yeah. That's an important place to start.
It
right?
is
Because
such
I think
an
people
important...
underestimate the sort of mindset you come into this kind of work with, because it then informs your choices, your speeches, your writing, the solutions you propose. Go on.
Well, I think that if we are encountering each other as other in the field of the other, we can never actually know each other. We just have to speak with one another. And Shakespeare gives us those worlds that unfold over 3 hours. And what he asks us to do as spectators is not just be entertained, not pay our money, get our ticket, go in and have a catharsis moment, laugh, cry, cheer, and leave the theater and go back to our everyday worlds. His plays invite us to imagine a different world, something other than what we're doing is possible, and that we can go back into our everyday encounters and change them and rewire them. And so I think that for me, the theater is an ecosystem for a creative democracy. John Dewey said that in 1939, as soon as we start treating the democracy as monolithic, as something separate from us, democracy dies. It's always creative. We're
Democracy
always...
and education.
That's right.
Right.
And I think about that in the theater, I think about that in the classroom, and I think about that in a creative democracy, that all three of those ecosystems are ways that we encounter one another relationally, culturally, and structurally.
Yeah.
And how we go about that shapes whether we have a tragedy or a comedy.
Yeah. So you are a Shakespearean scholar, and I know in your early, right, air quotes for those listeners who can't see me, that's where your field of study was. That's what you wrote about. But it sounds like at some point your engagement with that scholarship led you to start thinking of these bigger ideas of civic engagement, democracy, other worlds, our place in it, our responsibility as citizens. When did that point take place, and what was the sort of driver to say, you know what, there's some bigger things I need to be tackling here?
I remember I can almost pinpoint the day. So just before COVID hit, I had finished a book with 2 collaborators called Shakespeare's Guide to Hope, Life, and Learning. We had taken 5 years to do this. We were arguing that Shakespeare gives us these opportunities to exercise critical hope muscles, critical empathy, and critical love. And we took a number of plays and found moments where that happened. So we had just theorized this sort of trinity of values of hope, love, and empathy, and finished it. The manuscript was done. COVID hit. And all of the things that I love, the theater, the classroom, Shakespeare, all of those social institutions that I thought were always going to be there were shut down. So the thing that I had theorized
in one fell swoop, right?
Swoop,
Like
on March 13th, 2020,
Yeah,
every
yeah.
university in Canada shut their doors.
Right.
And so where I had anchored my hope, which was Shakespeare and the classroom, were gone overnight. And I felt, with the humility necessary to know that the universe does not talk to me, but I felt that the universe was asking me, yes, that's fine. You've got these theoretical frameworks and you're so clever and you figured this out. Now anchor it in practice in your everyday. And now you don't have the institutions to do that work. Find a new anchor for hope. And so when those universities shut down and we started to hear words like unprecedented and pivot, I started to think about where I anchor hope, and it was in universities. And so I started to reach out to all sorts of thought partners, including you and luminaries from across Canada and around the world, to try to reorientate where I locate hope and how we build Hope University.
So why would you say you anchored hope in universities?
I think that there's nothing more hopeful than being willing to transform and to think differently than you think and to see differently than you think.
So your answer assumes that the university is interested or set up infrastructurally to transform and think differently than you think. I'm not. This is not like a broad critique of universities, but I just want to name the assumption because I think some of your current work is getting people to do that naming or do the actions behind that transformation.
Yes. The book starts with an invitation.
And by book, by the way, Dr. Riddell is referring to Hope Circuits, I assume?
Right.
Okay.
Hope Circuits.
Before you tell what the book starts, tell us about the book.
Well, Hope Circuits, Rewiring Universities and Other Organizations for Human Flourishing is a reflection of 300 interviews I did starting June 1st, 2020, and has spilled over. There's now in its second and third books are coming out, but really rumbling on what does it look like if we created organizations structurally and systemically dedicated to flourishing. And what you're pointing out is that universities have an integrity issue, because what we say we do on all of our brochures and recruitment material and pamphlets, and even we emblazon our mission on the walls of our Senate and board tables. What we say we do, which is transformation, civic engagement, making the world better, more just, more equitable, having a public purpose. What we say we do and how we actually anchor that in practice, there is a disconnect. Now, there's always going to be a difference between what we say and what we do. There's always going to be a gap between aspiration and operationalization. But the key is to, first of all, mind the gap and then be intentional about closing that gap with deliberate effort and intention and shared vision. And I work with a lot of universities, many of whom are minding the gap, but many others are not minding the gap, and the gap is wide and widening. And we see the impact of that on our students. We see the impact on the decline of trust in higher education. Canada has never seen a decline in trust in our publicly funded, social mission-driven institutions until very recently. And now we are starting to fall off a cliff. And you think that's because we have an integrity issue. We are not saying and doing in alignment. And this book and this entire project is about naming that, saying that out loud, drawing our attention to the gap without indicting people.
Yeah.
And I'm really tired of, I've read 100 books that are a damning indictment of higher education.
Right,
What is wrong? What is broken? The deficits and scarcity.
Right.
There is disdain for students, for faculty, for administrators. And for me, I'm done with those narratives. I think they're important. We see a forensic audit of all of the broken systems. That's important for us to look clear-eyed and candidly at the problem. But there's no invitation. There's just indictment. And I think invitation in your own sphere of control and influence, that you are an architect of a creative future, that you are absolutely and inextricably linked to one another in an ecosystem where if we all flourish, we flourish. If one of us is ailing, then it affects the entire ecosystem. I want to have those conversations.
Yeah. You know what? Where I tend to get stuck on, in agreement with you in terms of the sort of deficit discussions around higher ed is, quite frankly, in diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And I'm not actually talking about people who sort of wake up in the morning and hate this stuff. I'm talking about actually many, many of us who believe it, who support it, but forget that we can't just traffic in the dark spaces of the work. We can't just get stuck on pointing out the problems, right? The former President Obama used to say, don't bring me your problems, bring me your solutions. And so if we are going to be inclusive, if we are going to be equity-minded, we have to be very clear on what that leads to, right? And it is frustrating because I do feel like well-meaning people have ceded the argument to others that we do this because we love. We do this because we love the country, we love each other, there's a prosperous future if we figure these things out. But don't forget to mention that, right? Don't just, show up all the numbers and what the gaps are and hang your head and cry. And there's a space for that, but it has to lead to something, right? What is you brought up, I think this is the first time you were brought up that you're in Canada, Bishop's University, right? What is this discussion like? The whole arc of it, right? The sort of the challenges that the Canadian higher ed is facing, but also the ways in which people like yourself are addressing those challenges. What is that discussion like in Canada?
Well, so Canada as a higher education sector has 97 universities.
Okay.
Publicly funded, funded through provincial funding and then federal funding for research and infrastructure. So it's a very small ecosystem.
Yeah, that's Massachusetts, right?
That's right. Which is good and it's bad because our institutions are risk averse, intractable, difficult to change, conservative in a kind of sustaining the dominant paradigm. We have a number of our campuses who are, I think, experiencing nervous system dysregulation. There is unprocessed grief. There is suspicion and distrust.
Of?
You name whoever is at the opposite end of the table. So faculty and admin, board and senate, student and faculty, you name any of those combinations. And when you look at the decline of collegial conversations where we are supposed to be doing bicameral governance, and we are instead getting factions and labor strife and disengagement, we are in a real crisis.
Yeah.
And for the first time ever in Canadian higher education, universities are facing financial exigency. Now, I know that happens in the U.S. a lot more. We have only had one university.
We call that Tuesday, right?
Right. Well, and you're constantly seeing in the news a closure of a college. And we don't have that in Canada. The first and only time that a university has filed for bankruptcy was in 2022.
Damn.
Because the provincial governments are always bailing out universities.
Right.
And for the first time, the provincial government in Ontario said no to Laurentian. And it sent shockwaves across the sector where the dominant paradigm, the tools that we use for those dominant paradigms are no longer working. The anomalies are starting to accumulate. But we don't have a clear new paradigm yet to move towards. And so in the book, I talk a little bit about Thomas Kuhn's work on scientific revolution, where he talks about paradigm shifts, where as he said, in a dominant paradigm, anomalies start to accumulate. And what happens is people in the center start to double down on the center, which in fact only precipitates the crisis. It only speeds it up. And you get into a time of, he calls it extraordinary research. So in this moment where the dominant paradigm is dying and a new paradigm hasn't emerged, extraordinary research is when you start to put things together that are not usually put together. You throw things at the wall and see what sticks. You go back to fundamental principles and ask, who are we? What is our purpose? Why are we here? Who are we serving? Going back to the fundamental definitions of our work. And then in that moment of extraordinary research emerges a new paradigm. And then that fourth stage is aftermath of a new paradigm, which is for Kuhn always better because a new paradigm can address the anomalies that have accumulated from the older dominant paradigm. And I think that universities in Canadian higher education as a sector, but more broadly, are experiencing a moment of extraordinary research, that we know that the systems are broken and the systems are working exactly the way they're designed. Both of those things are true.
Yeah.
And we don't know what a new paradigm looks like. Where hope lies for me is making sure that people feel empowered to be architects of a new paradigm,
whatever a new paradigm
of a creative future, and not disengage in despair that it's inevitable that it's a dystopian future. I think that we are in this critical moment, this nexus, where what we do in the next 5 years shapes what we will inherit for the next generation.
So on that point, it almost seems to me then that what we learn from this moment is highly critical, right? Because to the extent that this will shape and create a new paradigm, there seems to be a need to have learned the lessons that led to the accumulation of the anomalies. Sorry, I can't say that word. Plural. So my question is to me, one of the lessons is, should you not then, in whatever new paradigm you create, should you not then be nimble enough so that you're not stuck in a dominant paradigm? Because then you're just repeating a cycle, right? Then it's a new dominant paradigm, the anomalies rise, and then you need another extraordinary research moment. It's a lesson from this that we weren't nimble enough. We were too conservative and too stuck on systems that were designed, worked as designed, and we all just assumed that was okay. Maybe there needs to be some flexibility so that we're always making space for new ways of thinking about something.
Yes. I am so profoundly moved by the work of Adrienne Marie Brown, who is an emergent strategist, who talks about the unfurling and co-creation and emergence and the importance of creating flexible enough systems and structures and ways of being that we can adapt in real time in human and humane ways. And her work, to come back to a point that you made earlier, where we sometimes get focused on deficit and scarcity and crisis, it's the dominant narrative of our time. She suggests that we can actually sit in abundance. And she coined this phrase, pleasure activism, where she said, we can't do the hard hope work as martyrs, as killing ourselves in broken systems, because we will burn out, we will deplete, we will despair, we will disengage. So that pleasure and joy and laughter and irreverence has to be part of social change movement. And I think, wow, don't we need that in higher education, where we take ourselves awfully seriously?
Way too serious. Well, I feel like actually has to be even more loudly communicated, because, and I say that's the only love in the world, right? But I meet so many people who do activism work, and it's almost as though we've been conditioned to evaluate the quality of the work by the degree of burnout we experience, right? And so if I show up tired and just exhausted, just fighting the good fight, like, well, I don't, why is that a good thing though, right? If this work is going to lead you to not be a whole person, I don't know if that outcome works for anybody. I'm not saying that good hard work doesn't need to be done, but there has to be a better strategy than this, right? And you know, and I'll use that to make a get back to the point about disruption and a kind of a new way of thinking of higher ed. And I kind of pick my audiences and company with whom I will say this stuff, because I don't want to sound Pollyanna. I don't want to sound like I'm a throw the baby and the bathwater out kind of person. Like, this is not sort of reckless commentary, right? But as a job that I love and teaching I love research, I love the university. I really do. That's a genuine feeling, right? But I also, on a daily basis, sometimes look at the system that we have, and just wonder, why isn't there more questioning of some of the archaic structures we have in place? And it almost feels like they're just there just to be there. Like, we all just come to assume that, when you come to a campus, you take 15 credit hours as a student, and then when 15 weeks, you get a grade at the end of it. And I always ask myself, in 2025 going forward, is this the best way to offer this product? And who's really tackling that big question, right? Or is this just what we've come to expect everything should look like? And we show up and we fit ourselves into the puzzle and we trudge on, right? And so then what happens is, even people who talk about revolution and transformation, it happens that here's to do the same thing we've been doing all the time slightly differently, right? And again, I don't want to bash all of that stuff, but maybe I'm just looking for a much more radical, provocative, pleasurable space to think about it. Does any of this show up in Hope University?
Absolutely. And I think, I maybe it's the second page of Hope Circuits, where I say that universities are very good at studying everything but themselves. We're not critically reflective about the systems and structures that we've inherited. And I share the parable from David Foster Wallace. He gave an amazing convocation speech in the 2000s, and he said, the one thing that I want you to walk away from is that you are constantly immersed in systems and structures that are invisible to you. So he tells this parable about an older fish who's swimming along and passes these two younger fish and says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And the fish keeps swimming, and one of the fish looks at the other and says, "What the hell is water?" And David Foster Wallace says, that is the one thing that we need to pay attention to. This is water. The things that are invisible to us, that we're immersed in, are shaping our mindsets, behaviors, perspectives, encounters, relationships, all of that. And if we are not paying attention to this is water, we can't change it. And so, and once you see the water, you can't unsee it. Once you see the systems and structures, you can't unsee them. And Ava DuVernay says, now that you know, what will you do? And that is a call to action. That's an invitation for us to see the water, to surface the systems, to understand that the systems were created for a very particular reason by very particular architects for a very particular group. And those systems and structures, some of them do not serve us anymore. And we have to release them and be willing to rewire so that we can create spaces for the kind of transformative learning that this new generation of learners is encountering, a world that is full of turmoil and instability and crisis.
But also possibility.
Oh, all the opportunity, all the creative future. And we have to be able to give them the tools to build and illuminate in their own context. And I don't think we're doing a great job of that at a systems level, at a sector-wide level, and at an institutional level. And I think embedded in your question is, where do we change it? How do we change it? And for a long time, I thought, and I am a mobilizer, an advocate, an activist, a grassroots builder of things. So I thought my answer for 15 years is, well, it's grassroots. And working with grassroots organizations and grassroots movements within institutions, even with a top-down, so that macro and micro convergence, where you had a university president on board and seeing that vision and connecting with grassroots movements, you still get stuck in that meso level, that middle management level, the ones who are the operations,
They call department chairs, right? right.
yes, or registrars, or
Right,
people who inherited systems that they have to make work. They didn't get to build those systems, but their job is in the whack-a-mole game. Their job is the hammer.
Right. It's like one course for this is not enough for me to be an incubator, right? This is that kind of right.
No, and you know what? Innovation is inconvenient to systems designed to reproduce itself.
Right.
So these little in a whack-a-mole game, if you imagine an innovator and you're somebody who pops up in all these different places, the systems and structures are built to be resilient. So there is somebody with a mallet waiting for you to pop your head up, so you get a little whack-a-mole. So what I've learned from this work, and I worked really closely with 4 organizations, 4 institutions in Canada for 5 years, is that once you got everybody on board, one of the things is that, well, the president leaves or the provost leaves, and you have to get a whole new group on board, or people burn out, or they get depleted. Increasingly, I think that this is a yes and, where we need influence at the sector-wide level, because we cannot ask individual institutions to pop their heads up and change when the entire rest of the sector is risk adverse and conservative.
But can an individual institution be almost like a proof of principle?
Yes,
Guess
and
what it could look like,
and innovators, and they can...
And then convince others,
yes,
perhaps.
Yes. So I think that it has to be a yes and that's why when I wrote Hope Circuits, it was not the authoritative text. It was not the prescriptive book. This is what you do in order to rewire your systems. It's a conversation starter and it's a movement builder. So that first book is taking us in a moment that feels uncertain and full of disruption and possibility and gives people tools to metabolize a moment to build a mindset.
Right.
And now the second and third book are going from mindset to movement. How do we convince other people to come with us?
So I want to ask you a question on that, because to go back to the fish and the water analogy, I am somewhat sympathetic to the fish who just discovers that this is water. So you're right, you can't unsee it. But as somebody who is a little bit in the change business, in the sense that I'm trying to convince faculty to consider their classrooms in a different way. I'm trying to convince administrators to build better structures around their faculty, things like that. I understand that if you were grandfathered into what feels like a fixed system, it's not just that you got into that system, is that you built your professional identity around doing things a very particular way. So when the Jessicas of the world walk in and be like, Hope Circuits, there's a little part of you is like, well, okay, are you saying like what I was doing was crap for the last 20 years, right? And so there's some sort of, gentility. I don't know if that's a word or not, but there's some sort of gentleness and care and intentionality around, okay, so when that water discovery is made, what's that conversation like? What's that pathway, that process like, where you slowly kind of reforming how you imagine your environment and how that environment has influenced your behaviors, and maybe then you have some more, you're probably more empowered actually, right? Because you recognize where the influences are coming from. Is that water awareness process something you've witnessed, been a part of? And I think people would love to hear what you've seen on either side of that.
Yes, it's so messy. And I should say that it's not linear and it's not age and stage based. So you can have senior professors who see the water for the first time in the last decade of their careers, and you can see junior and emerging faculty see the water almost immediately. So, the parable about the older fish and the younger fish doesn't hold water in
no pun intended.
Exactly, in our ecosystems. What I am so informed by is the work of Parker Palmer, who points out, I think what you were mentioning is that when we go through these systems and these structures, we internalize them. We are rewarded for particular behaviors. You said grandfathered. I think that's correct. We are being taught by people who reproduce how they were taught, and on and on and on. And so that a sort of moment where you realize that you've internalized things and turned it into your identity, turned it into something that's ontological. Then when you ask people to change, you ask them to change who they are. But Parker Palmer says that when we go through these systems, we learn to dismember ourselves. If we're first generation, or where my my father is an immigrant. I come from the East Coast of Canada. I've tried to fix my East Coast accent.
I didn't know that was a thing, but of course,
it
I'm
is.
not from there.
And so there's that active dismembering. The farther you get into the academy, the more impervious your knowledge is, the more you are looked to be an expert and the authority. And what brought us to this work in the first place was wonder and curiosity and inquiry and playfulness. And so this active dismemberment does real violence to our souls and our identities. And so when people see the water, it's often an act of remembering. If we're dismembered, that remembering of taking what is a divided life and living what Parker Palmer calls the undivided life is a powerful, transformative, messy, effective journey.
Did you have that journey?
Of course I did. And I see the water and go through transformation and messiness and difficulty all the time. That's the other thing about transformation is that it's not linear, it's iterative.
Yeah.
And we know that. We know Mayer and Land talk about thresholds and transformation as difficult, and cognitive dissonance is a feature, not a flaw.
Dude, I asked about you because, well, I mean, we had, different journeys just by definition, but I feel like when I reflect on my academic career, and I'm thinking even all the way back to grad school, a good chunk of it was me resisting that dismembering. Like seeing the cutlass coming down, like, you can't do this, you shouldn't do this, you need to talk like this, you need to, show up and behave this particular way in this setting. And just looking at that, it's like, but what does that have to do with me doing good polished work, right? And I never was able to give it language the way you just did, and thanks for that. But I just wonder, when I think about students, right, even at the undergraduate level, how many of them are going through a dismembering process without even realizing that's what's taking place. And so, again, is one of the lessons here for in our own operations to perhaps stop actively dismembering people from who they are and give that value, right? I mean, I guess the sort of social science term for it is cultural capital and cultural wealth and things like that. But I do like the way you're saying it, because, there is it's almost by the time you recognize what's happening, by the time you see the water, right? There's so many things that have already happened that now it's a whole slow process to bring it back.
I love that you resisted the dismemberment. I didn't have the language or the critical reflection. And I remember the moment where I started to dismember myself. And it was in my first graduate seminar. Brand new master's student, sat there 3 weeks into graduate school, and I gave this presentation, which I thought was lovely, and I really was excited about workshopping it with people. I wanted to rumble. I wanted to put the ideas in the middle of the table and get people's perspectives. I wanted to learn. I wanted to engage. I was curious about this work and thought, this is the place that we do it. And one of my fellow graduate students sharpened her knife, and as soon as I finished my presentation, went through an absolute evisceration of my argument, to the point where, I was not pronouncing. I said Weber and it's Weber, right? I didn't know that. I'm a first generation grad student. My dad is an immigrant. My frame of reference was not academia. I was just there because I was full of wonder and curiosity. And she completely destroyed my argument. And I saw the professor nod in agreement with that act of evisceration. And everybody else around that table saw what was valued, what scored points, what got into the favor of the professor. And in that moment...
And that being the dismemberment process. So they saw that and saw the value in what was taking place,
Yes. So I left shattered and thought, nobody's going to catch me unaware again, which of course then is the beginning of the process of knuckling up, getting impervious, imagining refutation, scoring points by dismembering or deconstructing somebody else's argument. That's where I saw that value very clearly signposted. And it took me a really long time to unlearn that and to remember a particular voice. So Hope Circuits is written to sound like me. It's conversational, but that took 20 years of me regrouping, because I sound like a Shakespeare scholar. In my early stuff, I sounded like a Shakespeare scholar. I dismembered myself, took out all the jokes, took out all the, and Shakespeare's full of dirty bits and gorgeous weirdness and bodies and all sorts of...
Hide the hither, I must chastise you with my tongue. I can't remember what that's from.
Well, and you know, he's so playful. And as a Shakespeare scholar, none of those jokes get put in. Everything that brings you to that work in the first place doesn't have a space in that scholarly voice, although that I think that is changing slowly. So I had to remember what I sounded like in that wonder, curiosity, emergence, and vulnerability necessary to sit as a learner. And so I think the invitation for people to see the water is an invitation to remember what a learner looks like and to sit in it, whether you're a 65-year-old philosophy professor. Sitting as a learner is a radical act. A university president to sit as a learner, a first-year undergraduate student to sit as a learner, not a student, but a learner, willing to transform, willing to be different than you were in community with others. And I think that is nothing short of audacious.
Yeah. So it sounds like that transformation that happened in 2020 was the point where you saw some of these high-minded principles of civic engagement, democracy, all of these things from that came out of your Shakespearean work, and you saw how it applied to perhaps rewiring universities. But also, it seems like at the same time, this was your own point of seeing the water, which was also the point of remembering. It seems like a pretty powerful collusion of all three. And I remember in the book, in Hope Circuits, you start the book off by talking about a pretty challenging time for your family. I think your husband had just fallen ill, kind of unexpectedly, if I remember that. How did the sort of personal and the professional intertwine? Because, you clearly made a choice to leave that in, right? Which to me signifies its importance in your own thinking. Talk us through what that impact was like.
Thank you for that question. It was a convergence of the personal and professional in a moment where the pandemic put us into a moment of groundlessness where everything we thought we knew fell away and you had to go back to fundamentals. So on March 13th, all of our universities closed and my husband was not there. I was Zooming into a Senate meeting where we were making the decision to close the university, and my husband was in a clinic getting a scan of his lungs because he had persistent pneumonia. And so that day led to the diagnosis of lung cancer, and this fabulously and obnoxiously healthy man, big varsity athlete, eats all the salads, drinks all the smoothies, goes to the gym. He's the virtuous one of the relationship, and diagnosed with lung cancer. And so all of a sudden I have my small children, age 4 and 6, at home because our school's closed. I have my husband with a shocking diagnosis of lung cancer. I have the theaters are closed, the classrooms are closed, the university is in distress. The sector is experiencing incredible disruption. And the question is, what do you do with that? What do you do when... And
lung cancer during the time of COVID.
That's right.
Mind you, right?
That's right. Yeah. And, when I dropped him off to have his lung removed, June the 1st, dropped him off on the outside of the hospital, which was surrounded by police cars and everything was in lockdown, and he had to walk into that hospital, and I went home and I started to write this book because for me, I needed to write the book I needed to read.
Right.
I needed to write my way into hope because otherwise I would feel all of the despair and I would be I was overwhelmed. I had full days where I would, I had to keep going because I had a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old that I was homeschooling while working a job that had just doubled overnight in terms of capacity, in terms of urgency, in terms of workload. And I had to make sense of it in real time. And so I wrote my way into hope, because otherwise my default is despair, is howling into the abyss, is hiding under the covers. And I literally sometimes would just block out 2 hours of my day titled Hide Under the Covers. And sometimes actually that's exactly what I needed to do.
Yeah.
And how do I live that undivided life that Parker Palmer asks us to do? How do I bring into alignment all of those forces that were converging and then share it with other people? So that was a big ask. And what I realized, and I've learned, and it's a question and a lesson that I learn over and over and over, is that grief and despair is not the opposite of hope. It is part of a hope circuit. That my framework for understanding hope has to be large enough and expansive enough to hold grief and despair and disorientation and joy and pleasure and love all in the same space. So that entanglement of grief and gladness was so keenly felt for me in that moment, and has changed the way in which I see the world and what is possible.
Is part of it, I'm trying to think what's the best way to phrase this, because, oh man, so many questions, but I'll go with this one. To me, when you have such a major life event like that, to someone so close, the grief never really goes away, right? Because there's a pre-lung cancer and a post-lung cancer, and I know he's alive and relatively well, right? But it's never sort of the same as before, and it's not, you're not in a space where like, oh, I'm trying to get it back to what it was in 2018 or whatever, right? But in kind of normalizing that, there's some amount of grief that will be present, and putting it within the tapestry of a bigger mosaic called hope, right? It reduces the temperature on what grief means, right? It almost normalizes it. That's part of it, right? Like when my dad was dying of Parkinson's, I sort of processed that, like in the early days, like, this is not, like, biologically speaking, he's still a physical being and he's still my father. But in terms of what fatherhood was with us growing up, like that kind of ended at a certain point. And processing it that way just made it, it's still hard, but it made it, I don't know, is bearable the word, right? But, so is some of this what you're asking your readers to do, right? To understand that hope is not kind of separate from grief and despair, and what does that look like? Maybe it's not always a loved one with a major health crisis, but it's also our professions, our universities. Translate that into what higher ed for me.
Well, and you mentioned Pollyanna before, as I'm not a Pollyanna, and I think that we often misname hope as something that is, think about Pollyanna as a little girl. So we infantilize and feminize hope. We make it soft and then we discount it. And I think that we have become so alienated from the very terms that need to save us. So love and hope and empathy and justice, all of those words, we have a kind of critical stance to and dismiss it. Well, we're doing the really important business over here with reason and rationality. We do not have time for that over there. And you would be surprised how many people, when I interviewed them for Hope Circuits, who I consider hope warriors, just doing that hard hope work, that gritty, messy, difficult work, would apologize and say, I'm not a Pollyanna. And I think, you know what? We have taken that word and we have lost our connection to it, and we need to rehabilitate it. And hope is very different than optimism. Optimism is, it's going to work out. I don't know how it's going to work out, but it's just going to work out. That is a stance, and it is without agency, without action. Hope is a verb, and hope has to be anchored in practice. It has to be done in every encounter, at every decision-making table, and it is difficult and fraught, and it is full of grief and rage and anger and disappointment and despair. And it's the thing Miriam Kaba talks about, where she says hope is a discipline. It is getting out of bed in the morning, and sometimes that's the most hopeful thing you could do, and then it's one foot in front of the next, in front of the next. And so I think that part of my project is to rehabilitate this concept of hope, to anchor it in action, to give people tools to anchor it in their practice, to see it in the kind of architecture of their world, and then within their spheres of control and influence, make it happen together in intentional community.
Yeah. I was stuck a little, well, not stuck, but, when I think back to when I read the book and you talked briefly about what happened to your husband, and, maybe this is just me reading into stuff, right? But I noted how brief it was. And I kind of got stuck on the 10 or 15 pages after, because I almost felt like in reading those pages, I could watch you processing your grief in every sentence, in every page, right? And as I'm reading it, I'm actually asking out, I'm wanting to ask you through the book, is this working? Did this do what it needed to do for you? Because I know you wrote the book for us. You wrote the book for higher ed. You beautiful words about what it could look like, not just as a thing that feels like, oh, it's up in the sky. No. It's a verb, it's an action, like you said, right? But at the same time, it was also giving you something that you really, really needed. And I have to ask if it did.
It is, and it's ongoing.
Yeah.
So I have the confession to make. I am stuck not finishing Hope Circuits 2.0 because I have one chapter that refuses to write itself. And
yeah, that's how that works, right?
Oh my word. And it's there. I have 70,000 words. I have all of these chapters. I started writing it as soon as I finished 1.0. I have a 3-book contract with McGill Queen's University Press, but I can't finish 2.0 because the one chapter that I need to write that is resisting me is how to heal.
Yeah.
And this chapter is so essential to, I think, my personal journey, my professional journey, my experience with the heartbreak of looking at higher education, knowing what it can be and what it sometimes looks like, the heartbreak of seeing structural and lateral violence. So I'm resisting, or the chapter is resisting me about how to heal, because as you said, grief never goes away. It never resolves itself. You just find a place to put it. And I think for me, writing and being in conversation and rumbling is where I can put my grief and where I can sit with it and see the shape of it, see the contours of it, recognize it, value it as part of that process, but not the only thing. And the How to Heal is even misnamed as a chapter because you never fully heal. Right. You never arrive at a place where you're like, okay, it's all better. Right? Even
you reshape maybe, but
that's right. And it's constantly iterative. It's that sort of Japanese art with the broken ceramics where the broken pieces are put together with gold, and it's where those cracks are, where the gold is. Right. So that in remembering, you're never going back to what it used to be. It's going to be different, and it should be different. And I think that for me is always going to be a process. And I don't think I'm going to stop writing books because I don't think I'm I'm going to get to a point where I'm like, yes, we've figured it out. In fact, Paulo Freire says that hope is the ethical quality of the struggle. It is not a destination. It is not you've become enlightened and you get to look at all the unenlightened people around you. There is an ethical quality of the struggle. And for me, there is an ethics to writing through it, to inviting people into conversation, to meeting them where they are, and to have that co-creative and iterative space where we can collectively make sense of the world in real time as it emerges and as we transform.
Let me ask you this last question. So earlier in the conversation, you talked about that sort of aspirational feature of universities where we say mission statements, etc., and the gap between that and what's practiced, right? And you said, and I agree that it is normal for that gap to exist. What we should be doing, what is asked of us, is to work in that gap, to do actual things to bridge what we say 30,000 feet to what's everyday, working to mind that gap, to use your phrase. And I think you said there were several universities who I think are sort of part of your network who are actively trying to mind that gap, right? And, so I want my audience to hear some specifics. I know it will take a whole other podcast for you to tell me the story of each and every one of them. So could you give me one example of an institution that's minding that gap? What does it look like? What's the gap? What is sort of the underground stuff that they do? Take that however you would like.
Well, I've spent the fall working with 18 organizations and 12 universities, going into what are each one a distinct ecosystem and being invited to say the quiet things out loud in community, sitting in circle and round tables. So one of the things that I did this fall that I loved was a joint board and Senate retreat.
Okay.
So there was lots of vitriol on campus, labor strife. There have been, across the Canadian sector, non-confidence votes for presidents, for board chairs. And so this particular university brought me in and said, we want you to do programming with the Senate to elevate their thinking and their fiduciary duties as governors of the academic enterprise. And we want you to come in and do programming with the board and educate the board, especially external board members, on how universities are weird, strange, beautiful, complex, messy organizations that are different than other industries in the corporate sector. And then to bring the boards and senates together in a joint board Senate retreat. So get them into rooms together where the only objective is to see each other's common humanity. Instead of yelling at each other, sometimes literally through bullhorns on street corners, to get them into a room to acknowledge
if it's not a bullhorn, it's not a yell, I'm just saying.
Oh, wow. And it is really happening. It is really, we have descended into entrenchment and monolithic, right? The administration says this, the union says this, the students say this. We've lost the respect and decency to say you are a fully three-dimensional, imperfect, messy human who has goodwill, trying to make decisions in rapidly changing context within broken systems, hoping for a happy ending. Shakespeare play again. So the only objective is to see each other's common humanity and get them into a room together. And so I did this programming. They read the book in advance. We did some read and rumbles. I trained facilitators in small working groups. I was warned several times that by different groups that the other groups will show up with their arms crossed and grumpy and ready to yell at each other or disrupt the sort of retreat. And none of that happened. All of the joy, laughter, crying, people were hugging at the end of it because we met them where they were. We invited them into co-creation. We got them to do some pre-readings. So instead of coming armored, they came relatively open with some shared vocabulary. And my joke was they could have hated the book, but at least they shared a common experience where they could take it apart together.
Right.
And they were given thought prompts to do critical reflection, to talk about their origin stories, to talk about what called them to this work in the first place, to point out together where their frustrations were, what kept them up at night.
In other words, you had them remember.
We had them remember. And it was remarkable. And I've done that with a number of universities now. And increasingly there is an appetite for that work. It requires a very confident and strong president, a really attuned board willing to sit as learners, a openness from Senate to elevate their thinking as fiduciaries.
What if you're like two out of those three things?
Then magic can happen. Magic can happen if you can get people into a room with intentional gathering, with some good food, where we can take off our armor and sit as humans. And I think that is the greatest privilege of this work, that the book was not meant to tell people what to do. It was meant to start conversations so we can get into community and figure this out together.
It's interesting just hearing you describe a collective remembering process. Because, I don't know if that's an accurate way to describe it, but
Yes.
that's essentially what it sounds like. I'm trained in STEM, right? And I like to sometimes say I'm pretend STEM because I guess some of my own water was really came from, the humanities and books and literature and the people who kind of always push me to think about human nature and how messy that is. And that's one of the reasons why I really loved your work, and I love what your university is trying to do, what Hope Circuit is trying to do, and know you always have a thought partner in me.
I love that. I'm so grateful to learn from you.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Chris.
Knowledge Unbound is brought to you by the Rios Institute for Racially Just, Inclusive, Open STEM Education. We are graciously funded by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. My guest today, Dr. Jessica Riddell. You can pick up her book, Hope Circuits, anywhere you get your books. Our producer, the wonderful, the irreverent, Mr. Segev Amasai.
Day by day, I am reminded that all the world's a stage.
Is that it? Was that? Segev promised a Shakespeare quote in honor of today's guest. I don't know enough Shakespeare to know. You have to confirm, dude.
Considering the guest that you've had, who's mentioned Shakespeare at least 25 times.
I mean,
in that amazing conversation that you two have had. Well,
it was amazing.
I feel a bit disappointed, but you know what?
Yeah. Well, I quoted the two lines that I knew while I was talking to her.
Good to know.
I don't remember anyone, but Shakespeare was great, and to be fair, she did talk about way more than just Shakespeare. She really talked about this major transformation she had around COVID 2020 and how that has led to her current work, and I really hope people are inspired by that. Eric, as we say goodbye for this week, tell us a little bit about where we can find you in 5 to 10 years professionally.
5 to 10 years. Well, I hope to become a doctor. My particular interests.
I'm a doctor, right?
Medical. Surgeon perhaps. Maybe neurosurgeon, cardiothoracic. But I know it's a very big give and take. Large amount of time in school. But hopefully also doing some community work. I've always wanted to make my own community clinic, or maybe some nonprofit to give back to my origins, because a lot of the things that I grew up from were very impactful in my journey, and it still is right now.
Yeah.
So I hope to continue that.
Well, we wish you a lot of luck, a lot of love. Thank you for being a guest with us today. Intro and closing. To everyone who enjoyed this episode, please take hope with you. What I loved about Dr. Riddell is the hope that she brings and infuses in everything that she writes and speaks about. And I hope you're able to bring that to your classrooms or wherever you call work. See you next week. Be excellent to each other.
Maybe it's the second page of Hope Circuits, where I say that universities are very good at studying everything but themselves. We're not critically reflective about the systems and structures that we've inherited. And I share the parable from David Foster Wallace. He gave an amazing convocation speech in the 2000s, and he said, the one thing that I want you to walk away from is that you are constantly immersed in systems and structures that are invisible to you. Hope is a verb, and hope has to be anchored in practice. It has to be done in every encounter, at every decision-making table, and it is difficult and fraught, and it is full of grief and rage and anger and disappointment and despair. And it's the thing Miriam Kaba talks about, where she says hope is a discipline. It is getting out of bed in the morning, and sometimes that's the most hopeful thing you could do. And then it's one foot in front of the next, in front of the next. And so I think that part of my project is to rehabilitate this concept of hope, to anchor it in action, to give people tools to anchor it in their practice, to see it in the kind of architecture of their world, and then within their spheres of control and influence, make it happen together in intentional community.
Yeah.
Who knew I would make it this far? They hated, they never believed me. Yeah, I would never drop the ball. I know I make it look easy. Yeah, Mayweather with the defense. I don't care what a critic got to say. I got them picking up the pieces. Better me, you really playing with your life. I'm about to come and run it all back. I'm the new era, about to snap back.
Oh, knowledge unbound, wherefore art thou knowledge unbound?
Like you're trying to write a poem.
Sounds like a Persona reference.
Well, I mean, at this one, you might as well just try to freestyle it behind the mic at this point.